Well, our international affairs editor, Kethevane Gorjestani, is joining me now in the studio. Kethevane, I mean, the events of the last 24 hours really show, don't they, how much US support for Israel has changed.
Yes, and really the reaction and the abstention for that resolution is a symbol of how the U.S. has evolved over the several months since the October 7th attack. Because the fact that there was no condemnation of Hamas just weeks ago would have been a non-starter, would automatically have triggered a veto of the United States. And if you look back, there's also been change with the language of support for Israel. It started out by Israel has the right to defend itself, period. Then they added, but the way it does so matters and they need to follow international law. Then they added the need to protect civilians and to take care of what was happening on the ground. You saw the same evolution of the language regarding that ground operation in Rafah. At the beginning, the Americans were saying any operation needs to have a credible plan as to how to relocate the civilians. Then they started saying, we don't support any type of ground operation in Rafah, and now they're calling it a possible disaster if it happens. So there again, you see that evolution, and you're seeing even an evolution a little bit in military support for Israel, which is something that has been key for decades from the United States. It always was a non-starter to condition sending weapons to Israel to anything the Israelis were doing. Then you saw Joe Biden recently talking about a possible red line when it comes to Rafah without getting into the specifics. Kamala Harris, the vice president, also talking about possible consequences if there was a ground operation in Rafah, again, without giving any details. And John Kirby of the National Security Council was asked whether there could be some conditioning or some pause in the weapons. And instead of the usual response from the Americans to that question, which is, we will never stop sending weapons to Israel and we'll stand by them, now he's saying, I will not get into hypotheticals, which is, of course, diplomatic speak for some possible little change. So you're seeing the slight change in the rhetoric coming out of the Biden administration that really betrays a growing real frustration with the Israeli government, but even more specifically with Benjamin Netanyahu himself.
And it comes as well in that context of a pretty tough relationship between the two men at the top, Benjamin Netanyahu and Joe Biden as well.
Absolutely. And it's been a sort of love-hate relationship between these two, and that relationship goes back decades. But there really have been several moments in which the tensions really boiled over. The first one was, of course, back in 2015. At the time, Joe Biden was the vice president of Barack Obama. We were in the middle of these Iran nuclear talks. And at the time, Benjamin Netanyahu sort of plotted with the Republicans in Congress to come and address a joint session of Congress without giving a heads up to the White House. At the time, the Vice President, Joe Biden, who traditionally sits behind the guests for those joint addresses, he refused to attend that speech. So that was a pretty tense moment in the relationship between the two men. Then you had the re-election, the most recent re-election of Netanyahu in December 2022. And usually a new Israeli prime minister gets a very quick meeting head-to-head with the U.S. president, no matter who they are. It took months for Benjamin Netanyahu to get a face-to-face meeting with Joe Biden. And it was not even at the White House. It was in September on the sidelines of the United Nations. And yes, after that, Joe Biden, of course, went to Israel after the October 7th attack. But you saw that there was criticism of the judicial overhaul, and there were some words exchanged between the two that showed that there was tension. And most recently, of course, you had that speech by Chuck Schumer in the Senate talking about Benjamin Netanyahu and as an obstacle for peace, calling for new elections. And while the White House said that it was not involved in that speech, Joe Biden did call it a great speech. And so you're starting to see these frustrations and these disagreements really boil over, putting into context that both men, of course, have their own domestic situations. Benjamin Netanyahu, of course, but Joe Biden, of course, in a re-election year. And that also has some sort of bearing on how these two negotiate together.